To consider this afternoon the question of why we practice in the first place. What is the purpose? What is the motivation for our practice? The might say the correct answer or the highest answer is for realization of the unconditioned. But the reality is very few people begin the practice with that even as a consideration. And even people who have been practicing for a long time, it's often not at the forefront of their mind if they were to think of why they practice. In one sense, it doesn't matter. There's a saying that even the motivation purifies itself with time. Almost everybody, I think, who takes up spiritual practice, initially it's to deal with suffering in their being in one form or another. And this in itself is not an ignoble pursuit. Another way of expressing the aim of the path is the elimination of suffering. And the Buddha himself, when he was a bodhisattva, his initial motivation for undertaking his spiritual quest was to overcome old age, sickness, and death that he saw in the form of the divine messengers. Initially, for a lot of people, it's experienced, I think, on a much less universal or abstract plane, and they're dealing with personal limitations, neurotic complexes. Particularly Westerners tend to see things in psychological terms, and it's a desire to overcome your neurotic limitations and patterns. Some people express this in terms of healing. I sometimes hear people talk in that kind of language, which I always find a bit limiting. If you're thinking in terms of healing, it's a kind of a limiting model, because to begin with, you're seeing yourself as somehow broken or in need of healing, and the psychological model or the model of healing only gets you so far. And it's essentially a psychoanalytic kind of model. And the limitation of that is the same as what Sigmund Freud said about his therapy, was that it can only get you to the state of ordinary misery. I suppose if someone is stuck in an extraordinary level of misery, that may sound like a bonus, but it's not a very lofty goal to seek out this kind of mundane unraveling of complexes and healing. This has been called by some as rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. Get a better view, or get out of the sun, or get some shade. Rearrange the deck chairs on the Titanic. And essentially, what the mundane goals are looking to improve one's condition within samsara, to maintain a more comfortable position in the conditioned world. This can take the form of desire for rebirth in higher realms. And this is something one hears more often in Buddhist countries like Thailand, that people think that the idea of many people think that the idea of nibbana is too remote, too abstract, and they're seeking to rebirth as a dewa, which falls within their possibility of imagination. One Thai person said that even the idea of being reborn as a Brahma seems too dry and remote. best they hope for is rebirth as a Dewa. Actually, a less limited a goal than the kind of materialist-minded Westerner who wants to just get rid of their neurosis and be able, meet people and be comfortable in social situations and be happy. And this is rebirth as a Dewa is a more lofty or noble ambition than just kind of being a slightly happier human. But still, these are limited goals, limited to within conditioned existence. There is a kind of a paradox or a difficulty with our Theravada form of Buddhism in that the goal, the unconditioned asankata nibbana, is, by definition, it's ineffable, it's inexpressible. It can't be grasped by the conditioned mind. On an intellectual level, when I first was approaching Buddhism and I was looking at different, decades ago when I first started reading, and that is one thing that particularly attracted me to Theravada, was the purity with which it treated the transcendental. There was no personification of it or romanticization. As the unconditioned is other. It's not this. It's completely treated in a completely pure way. Whereas most other religious traditions tend to kind of jazz it up, with flowery language and poetic imagery. So on an intellectual level, that's quite appealing, the purity of it. But on an emotional level, it doesn't really leave the individual much to grasp at. Until one has glimpsed the unconditioned, it remains a complete mystery. And that becomes a difficulty for the practitioner in that, you're asked to do all this work and keep precepts and meditate, and what are you going to get at the end? Well, we can't really tell you, but it's really good. It sort of leaves it a little open-ended. And it is actually in the Pali Canon, when the Buddha is talking about the path, and the language used is that there's distinction made of individuals between Seka and Aseka. Seka means a learner. It literally is a listener. It's like a student, a hearer, and one who's beyond hearing, beyond learning, listening is Arahant. One only becomes a Seka, a learner, at the stage of stream entry. Until one's glimpsed the unconditioned, one's not even really on the path fully. It's one is not considered a Seka, a learner. And this means that for individuals practicing up to that point, the goal is always going to be somewhat, the motivation, let's say, rather than a goal, the motivation is always going to be somewhat limited. With study and wisdom and maturity of practice, one begins to see the potential of realizing the unconditioned even before it's realized. But the motivation that really keeps you going will be more in terms of the lessening of suffering on the one hand and the opening of wisdom on the other. I think this is really the carrot and the stick. The stick is suffering. This is what really, and this is in the Upanishad Sutta, the initial position of suffering. The first movement out of it is faith. The idea that there isn't just the hope that there is a way out of this. And it's not a wrong motivation to want to release from suffering. Until it's properly understood, it's a limited motivation. If we're trying to alleviate suffering of certain kinds and not suffering in general, suffering in the abstract, all suffering. And ultimately it's release of suffering. The highest aspiration in that angle is the ending of suffering of all beings. There's a great compassion that the Buddha had that motivated him to get up and teach and not just sit on his seat and enjoy the bliss of liberation. The other, what we might say the carrot, is the realization of wisdom, the dawning of understanding. This is also a noble motivation to gain wisdom, to gain understanding of things as they actually are. In the Jataka stories, when the Bodhisattva was in those lifetimes in which he was consciously working for liberation, the language used is that he was aiming at omniscience, sabanyuta, all knowing, knowing of all things, which in the Jataka, in the period the Jatakas were composed, that was like a synonym for Buddhahood, sabanyuta, state of all knowing. This is the elimination of ignorance, the clearing away of the fog of delusion. As we go along the path, this becomes a stronger motivation. We begin to see the benefit of understanding. And as I said, the motivation itself purifies with time. As we continue with the practice, then everything matures, including our sense of purpose and our motivation, the reason why we're practicing. The initial beginning is, as I've said, often some desire to escape specific individual suffering. And there's sometimes even other motivations. You occasionally come across people who take up meditation with the desire of attaining psychic powers. Usually those people don't last very long. It's kind of a romantic delusion of youth. They want to attain psychic powers. I remember one fellow that I encountered who kept asking me questions about psychic powers, and I told him after a bit, I told him, that's not really the purpose of the path. It's not attaining psychic powers. And he was a real strange fellow. He said, well, I know there's some bastards out there reading my mind, and I want to be able to protect myself. So there's all sorts of reasons why we begin to meditate. But we should be moving towards the aspiration of realizing the unconditioned and not being satisfied with any lesser goal, with any position within samsaric becoming. Any position, even the highest, even a existence as a deva or even as a Brahma, is still conditioned and subject to impermanence and suffering and emptiness. Still subject to the characteristics. It's still samsara. The word samsara means the turning around. It's from the verb samsarati, which really means to go around in a circle, to wander around in a circle. The idea of samsara is aimless or senseless, futile circling. That all samsaric goals and ambitions in the end come to naught. They are not. There's no position within samsaric becoming that is stable or lasting or ultimately intrinsically meaningful. Existence or manifestation, conditionality is in a way it's a kind of a flaw, a dysfunction. It's like a shattering. It's not. It's a partiality. So it's always, of course, hard to see that from the inside, which is one of the reasons why only from stream entry on is one considered a sikha, a learner, because then it becomes really possible having seen the other side of things. Initial practicing with the idea of attaining stages on the path is also for many people a kind of a problem or a delusion. They become goal-oriented in a wrong sort of way, like scorekeeping, the idea of wanting to attain something. it's better to think of the path in terms of purification and simplification. That the realization of the unconditioned, the experience of stream entry, is what happens when certain defilements are eradicated. In a sense, it's a more natural state of mind without the defilements. The mind moving towards that rather than gaining something out there, something new. Yeah? For many beginning practitioners who have done some reading or listening and have some theoretical knowledge, the idea of attaining stages of the path becomes a sort of a fantasy for them. You hear this often joked about that, I've heard senior monks talk about this. They'll say that, oh, when I first 20, 30, 40, whenever years ago I started practicing, and, I had the idea I'd go on a 2-week retreat and attain stream entry. Then I'd go off on a cruise in the Bahamas and do this and that. This is a sort of a all my problems will be solved. Now I'll be happy and just carry on with my conditioned existence. Let's say from those that have grounds to speak of it, they could say that before you attain to stream entry, whatever you imagine it might be is going to be wrong. That the reality is going to be in some sense much less than what you think it is, but in a more profound sense it's much more than you could imagine it possibly to be. Whatever you imagine it to be is wrong, because you can't possibly encompass, and even one who has experienced it cannot possibly explain it, and you can't possibly imagine it if you haven't experienced it. But what we can say from a practical point of view is that realization of the unconditioned makes even that momentary glimpse of it makes a fundamental change in the depth of the being and gives a new perspective on things. That there's a change in perspective because the condition is no longer all that seen as the all. And it's now seen in a new light. And this is also true, this kind of way of looking at it is also true in a more partial sense with the realization of jhana. If one has got enough maturity in meditation to have jhana experiences, then the understanding of the sensual desire mind is changed, because now one sees that from the outside. This samsara conditionality is layered, right? For human beings at our level of existence, our default mode of consciousness is sensual desire realm consciousness. And the conditions of that level of consciousness are very noisy for us. They demand attention. But they're not the deepest or most fundamental level. And the defilements associated with that level are, again, the noisiest, and they cause the most immediate trouble, but they're not the deepest and most fundamental underlying defilements. They're relatively superficial. The defilements associated with the higher realms of the realm of form and formless, the desire to be and the desire not to be, bhava tanha and vibhava tanha, are more fundamental. They're deeper. They underlie the sense desire realm defilements of sense desire, ill will, anxiety. These are noisy and take up a lot of mental space and clamor, but they're not as deep. They don't cut as deep as the others, as the form and formless realm. And we can see this contrast from, if the mind can rest in those other states, then one can understand the realm of sense desire from a new angle. It's like if you've ever had the experience of hiking or climbing in hill country, and you climb up to a high place in a hill and look down at the town or the village at the foot of the hill, and you see it, the whole thing laid out. You see the streets and the little houses and the cars moving around. And then, maybe you spend the afternoon up there, then you go down the hill and you're back into the town and you're right in it. It's an entirely different perception. It's noisier and it's more immediately clamoring for your attention. But you don't see the totality of it. And with the realization of the unconditioned, one steps outside of conditionality altogether. You know? Even if it's just a glimpse, then it provides a new angle on things. And it's said that one who has attained to stream entries only has the possibility of 7 more rebirths. And the reason for this is that it's impossible to turn back completely from that point. Once one has realized the unconditioned, there's a movement of unraveling begins. It's inevitable. And the longest it can take is 7 lifetimes. So this point of motivation, purpose of the path, is something that, as I said, it will purify itself with time, but it's something we should bring our minds to consider from time to time, and occasionally to bring the mind to try and take in the big picture, the vista. Where are we going? What's the purpose of this? Most of the time we have to attend with the meditation, we have to attend to business right at this moment, on the nose tip or the belly, or what's the Dhamma, the object of consciousness. At this moment, at a very micro level, what's going on at this moment right now, immediately before us. That's where we have to spend really most of our time to make progress. But it's necessary to pause now and again and look at the big picture and consider why you're doing this and where you're going.